The streets and the struggle. Lexi's footsteps echoed through the quiet, cracked pavement, each step more of a defiant declaration of survival than a mere act of walking. The sun bore down from above, the heat radiating off the pavement in waves, but it didn't bother her much. It was almost as if the sweat beading on her brow was just another part of the daily grind. She had long stopped caring about how the world saw her, an older black woman, worn by time and circumstance, trudging through life with nothing but a weathered dog by her side. To others, it might have seemed like a tragic sight, one of defeat and neglect. But to Lexi, it was simply life. Beside her, Sam, her 88-year-old German shepherd, padded quietly along. His coat, once glossy and proud, had turned an uneven gray, but his eyes still sparkled with a quiet understanding. For years, he had been more than a companion, he had been her silent protector, the one who kept her grounded when the world seemed to spin out of control. Sam wasn't just a dog, he had once been a hero, a police K-9 officer trained to detect drugs, search for criminals, and protect his partner at all costs. In his prime, he had saved lives, led police officers into dangerous situations, and responded without hesitation. But now, as his body aged, so did his strength. Yet in spite of the gray hairs on his muzzle and the limp that had begun to form in his step, there was something undeniably powerful about him. Maybe it was the quiet dignity he carried, or perhaps it was the loyalty that never faltered. In a world that had abandoned them both, it was the only thing they had left. As they passed by the row of houses, the whispers and jeers started again. Lexi could feel the eyes upon her, the judgment thick in the air. Some muttered words of pity, others of scorn. The world had been cruel to her before, and it seemed to be growing more impatient with her as time went on. The whispers started low, like the buzzing of bees, but soon they grew louder, cutting through the stillness like sharp blades. "Crazy black woman, get that filthy dog outta here." The words were venomous, seething with hate. Lexi had heard them countless times before, each syllable sharper than the last. But she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that the world wasn't kind to people like her. It wasn't kind to someone who had once been a shining example of resilience, only to be beaten down by a system that cared little for those who had nothing to offer but their lives. "Look at that filthy beast. It probably has rabies, too," another voice screamed, louder now, fueled by something far more malicious than simple disdain. But Lexi didn't stop. She tugged gently on Sam's leash, his warm body pulling beside her, his calm demeanor offering her a moment of solace in the midst of the chaos. Sam had always known when it was time to protect, and when it was time to simply stay still and remain silent. His presence, though aging, was a reminder of a time when life had been easier, when things had made sense. Another shout rang out, this time a man's voice cutting through the air, "You're the reason this neighborhood's falling apart. You and your dog bring nothing but trouble." Lexi didn't look back. She had learned long ago that to meet their eyes, to acknowledge their hatred, was to give them power. And she had none to spare. Her pace remained steady, a quiet act of defiance. As they neared her home, the familiar, dilapidated house loomed ahead. The walls were stained with the grime of years of neglect, and the windows, once clear, had fogged up with dirt and decay. This was her world now, the place she had learned to call home, despite its flaws and the endless reminders that she didn't belong. She reached the front door, but before she could open it, a sound like the crack of thunder hit the house. Something splattered against the windows with a wet thud, followed by a shrill voice screaming from the street. "Get outta here, you filthy hag. You're bringing this place down. You're the reason we don't get our payouts. Just go already." Another hit, and another. Rotten eggs, bags of garbage, and foul-smelling substances pelted her home. Lexi's shoulders sagged, but she remained still, her hand still gripping the doorframe, as if she could hold on to something solid in a world that felt like it was constantly crumbling beneath her. Sam growled softly beside her, his ears pinned back in defense. He wasn't a young dog anymore, but in that moment, he reminded Lexi of the fierce protector he had once been. He wanted to leap into action, to show the world that he wasn't just some old, washed-up dog. But Lexi held him back with a gentle hand on his neck. "It's okay, Sam," she murmured, her voice calm despite the chaos. "We've been through worse." And it was true. They had. She and Sam had weathered the storms of judgment, of being cast aside by a world that never understood their bond. People saw her and saw nothing more than a broken woman clinging to an old dog. They didn't see the history between them, the years of shared moments, the quiet love and respect that had grown over time. No one cared to know that Sam had once been the protector of a community, that he had been an officer in the law. They didn't see the strength it took for him to still stand by her side, to still protect her in whatever way he could. Lexi felt a pang in her chest, a mixture of frustration and sadness. But she didn't let it show. Instead, she turned to face Sam, her hand reaching down to stroke his fur, smoothing it over the patches of age and wear. The quiet love she felt for him spoke volumes more than any of the hateful words ever could. He was all she had left. With a soft sigh, she stepped inside the house, closing the door behind her. The constant noise from the street didn't stop, but she had learned to block it out, to let it fade into the background. Inside, there was no anger, no hatred, just the silent comfort of Sam's presence. They made their way through the darkened hall to the living room, where the light from the single lamp cast long shadows across the walls. The house was a mess. The mailbox overflowed with bills and reminders of debts she couldn't pay. On the floor, crumpled paper lay scattered around the room, an eviction notice that she hadn't had the heart to open yet. Lexi bent down, picking it up with a sigh. It had come just a week ago, informing her that she had to leave or face legal action. It wasn't the first time it had happened. But this time, she wasn't sure if there was anywhere left to go. The thought of being out on the streets with Sam made her stomach turn, but she didn't allow herself to dwell on it. There was no point in worrying about the inevitable. Sam padded over to the worn couch and laid down, his body heavy and tired. Lexi watched him, her heart aching with the knowledge that his time was running out. The strength that once defined him was fading. And though he would always remain her protector in spirit, Lexi knew that the day would come when she would have to take on that role for both of them. For now, she let the silence settle around them. The world outside could do what it wished. Inside, she and Sam would remain, two souls bound by years of hardship, loyalty, and love. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. But as the hours passed and the sun set, the sounds outside grew louder, more aggressive. The pounding on her windows continued, but Lexi didn't flinch. It was just another night, another round in a battle she had been fighting for far too long. And she would fight it until the very end, not because she had to, but because Sam deserved it. And that, to her, was the only thing that mattered. A silent war. The days bled into weeks, each one feeling like an unending repetition of the last. But Lexi's resolve never wavered. Every morning, she would wake up to the sound of the world outside her window, shouts, insults, and the occasional bang of garbage hitting the house. But she was used to it now. The emotional bruises didn't sting as much anymore. Lexi had long stopped expecting kindness or understanding from the people around her. She had learned that in this life, you didn't wait for the world to be kind to you. You fought for what was yours, no matter how much it cost. And so, she fought. But the fight was wearing on her, wearing her thin. Even though she had Sam by her side, the weight of the world bore down on her like an invisible chain. She was tired, not just in body, but in spirit. The struggle for survival was no longer just a matter of finding food, of paying rent. It was a constant, grueling battle against the erosion of her dignity, her identity, and her worth. Every day, it felt like the people around her were chipping away at her, one cruel word, one hateful glance at a time. Sam had always been there, standing by her side, providing her with the only real comfort she had. His loyalty never faltered, his presence never wavered. He was the reminder that not everything in this world was lost. Not everything had been broken. But even Sam was growing old, his once boundless energy now slowed by the passage of time. His joints ached. He slept more than he used to, and Lexi could see the weariness in his eyes. The spark of his youth was fading, and it was becoming harder for him to keep up with the world around him. The harsh whispers outside her window grew louder, more personal, as if the neighbors could smell her desperation. Lexi had stopped replying to their taunts long ago. They would yell things like, "Go back to where you came from," or, "Why don't you just disappear, you old hag?" But Lexi never gave them the satisfaction of an answer. She wasn't here for their approval or their acceptance. She had her reasons for staying, reasons they would never understand. There was a brief moment of peace when the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow across the city. Lexi would often take Sam for walks in the cool evening air, the streets quieter than usual, the venomous voices replaced by the sounds of the wind and the distant hum of city traffic. Those moments, though brief, were her reprieve, her brief escape from the relentless weight of the world. But even during these moments, the worry gnawed at her. The eviction notice was still crumpled on the floor, a constant reminder of the fragility of her situation. And no matter how much she tried to ignore it, it was always there, lurking in the background like a storm on the horizon. The landlord was growing impatient, and every time Lexi received another call or letter, it felt like the walls were closing in even further. It wasn't just the threat of being thrown out that kept her up at night, it was the unknown. Where would she go? What would happen to Sam? He couldn't live on the streets, not in his condition. The thought of losing him, of watching him struggle like that, was unbearable. That's when the dark thoughts began creeping in, the ones that whispered in the quiet hours of the night. Would she be able to keep fighting? Was there even a way out of this? Or was she just waiting for the inevitable collapse? She didn't want to think about it, didn't want to acknowledge the creeping despair that sometimes found its way into her heart, but it was hard to ignore. Every time she looked into Sam's tired eyes, the weight of the world pressed harder on her shoulders. Sam, sensing her unease, would nudge her with his nose, offering the only comfort he knew. He could still sense her distress, even if he couldn't fully understand it. And Lexi, ever grateful, would stroke his head softly, whispering words of reassurance, though she wasn't entirely sure if they were for him or for herself. And then one evening, everything shifted. It had started like any other evening. Lexi had just finished dinner, a meager meal, mostly leftovers, and was sitting in the small, dimly lit living room. Sam was by her side, resting on the couch with his head on her lap. The world outside had quieted, and for a moment, Lexi allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could finally find a little peace. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic sound of Sam's breathing soothe her as she absent-mindedly ran her fingers through his fur. But that peace was shattered when a loud, booming knock rang at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time someone had come knocking, but there was something different about this knock, something urgent. Lexi sat up, her body tense, a wave of dread washing over her. Who could it be now? Sam lifted his head, his ears twitching. He let out a low growl, a sound Lexi hadn't heard from him in a while. The old dog had been protective, but age had dulled his senses. He still had the fire inside him, but it wasn't as strong as it once was. Lexi stood up cautiously, her hand reaching for the door handle. She knew what it was like to live in fear of the unexpected. She had lived with it for years, and now, every knock, every sound at the door, was a reminder of how fragile her existence had become. She opened the door slowly, her heart in her throat. Standing on the other side was a tall man, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. But there was something in his posture that immediately struck her as different from the usual riffraff that passed through the neighborhood. This man wasn't here to harass her or make her life harder. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly, his voice low and calm, almost like a whisper in the darkness. "I know what you've been through. And I know what you're still facing." Lexi hesitated. She didn't know this man. He could be another stranger, another threat, but something about him seemed genuine. Maybe it was the softness in his voice, or the way he stood, unthreatening, his hands held slightly away from his body. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He seemed to sense her uncertainty, offering a slight nod before he spoke again. "I've been watching. And I've heard about you and your dog. Sam, right?" At the mention of Sam's name, Lexi's heart skipped a beat. Who was this man? How did he know Sam? "My name's Jason," he said. "I used to work with your dog. I was part of the unit he worked with when he was a police K-9. I didn't know where he'd gone after he retired, but when I heard about you and what's been happening here, I knew I had to come." Lexi's mind was racing, processing his words, trying to make sense of them. She could barely comprehend the idea that someone from Sam's past had shown up at her door, someone who knew the dog in a way few people did. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice a little more firm now, though she still felt the unease creeping through her. "I'm here to help," Jason said simply. "I know you've been going through hell. The neighbors are making things worse, the landlord is trying to force you out. It's not right. But I'm not here to just sympathize. I've got connections. Resources. I can help you get out of this situation. And more importantly, I can help you protect Sam." The offer hung in the air between them, and Lexi felt a strange sense of hope stir within her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Could this be the break she'd been waiting for? For the first time in a long time, Lexi allowed herself to believe that there might be a way out, a chance at something better. The battle was far from over, but maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in it anymore. The breaking point. Lexi stood at the door for a moment, Jason's words hanging in the air, like a promise she hadn't dared to hope for. Her mind raced, trying to process everything. Help? Connections? Sam's past as a police K-9 was something Lexi had long kept buried in the corners of her mind. It was a part of him that belonged to another life, a life that was far removed from the rundown house she now called home. But here, standing in front of her, was someone who saw Sam not just as a loyal companion, but as the hero he had once been. A hero who had saved lives and upheld justice. And now, Jason was offering help. Real help. For both of them. Sam let out a soft whine from the couch, his ears perked up as if he understood the significance of the moment. Lexi looked down at him, his tired eyes still holding that faint glimmer of the strength he once had. He had fought for so long, for so many years, and now it was her turn to fight for him. But this time, maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to do it alone. Without saying anything, Lexi stepped aside and motioned for Jason to come in. "You'd better explain yourself, Jason," she said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of curiosity in her tone. Jason stepped into the dimly lit room, his presence both calming and unfamiliar. The room was cluttered, a mixture of old furniture and scattered papers, the remnants of a life in turmoil. But it was still home to Lexi and Sam. It wasn't much, but it was all they had left. "I know this probably seems like it's coming out of nowhere," Jason began, settling into the armchair in front of her. "But I've been watching you, Lexi. I've been following the situation with the neighborhood and the landlord. I know things have gotten rough, and I can't just stand by and watch it happen." Lexi raised an eyebrow, feeling a twinge of skepticism. "You've been watching me? How long have you known about the trouble I'm in?" "Longer than you think," Jason replied, his voice calm. "I've been keeping tabs on the neighborhood for a while. There's something off about the way the tenants here are treated, and I've been investigating. Your name came up more than once. People talk, Lexi. They talk about you, about Sam. I know what they're saying. Lexi's heart sank. She had never thought of herself as someone who was being watched by anyone other than the people who lived nearby. The constant insults and the rotten eggs thrown at her windows were one thing, but the thought of someone watching her in secret was unsettling. Why? She asked, her voice quieter now. Why are you doing this? What's in it for you? Jason took a deep breath, his gaze steady. I owe Sam, he said simply. I was one of his handlers back when he was with the police. He saved my life more times than I can count, and when he retired, I didn't have any way of keeping in touch. I lost track of him, but when I heard he was with you, and heard what you've been going through, I knew I had to do something. Sam was a hero. I don't want to see him forgotten or mistreated. And I don't want to see you and him suffer because of people who don't know what it means to have loyalty or respect. The sincerity in his voice hit Lexi harder than she expected. She had spent so many years fighting on her own, feeling invisible and alone, that hearing someone speak with such conviction about helping her felt almost foreign. Could she trust him? Was this really someone who cared, or was it just another empty promise, another person with an agenda? But as she looked at Sam, lying peacefully on the couch, his eyes flicking between her and Jason, she felt a sense of certainty that she hadn't felt in years. Jason wasn't just some stranger off the street. He was someone who knew what Sam was capable of, what he had given to the world. That meant something. I don't know what to say, Lexi finally muttered, her voice soft, almost lost. I've been alone for so long. And Sam, he's not what he used to be. He can barely walk anymore. I don't know how to keep going. Jason leaned forward, his eyes kind but firm. You don't have to do it alone anymore, Lexi. That's what I'm here for. I can help you fight back. We can take down the landlord, expose the way you've been treated, and get you the resources you need. I know people. Good people. People who want to see things change. Lexi stood in silence for a moment, her mind swirling with the weight of his words. The idea of fighting back seemed impossible. How could she take on the whole system, the people who had been making her life hell for so long? She didn't have the strength for a battle like that. But then, as if reading her mind, Jason spoke again, his voice unwavering. I'm not asking you to do it alone. This won't be easy, but it's possible. The truth is, Lexi, there's more going on in this neighborhood than you realize. The harassment, the threats, it's not just because of you. There are others in this community who are too scared to speak up, too beaten down to fight. But if we stand together, if we shine a light on what's really happening here, we can make a difference. The words resonated with Lexi more than she wanted to admit. She had always fought for survival, just scraping by day after day. But the idea of fighting for something bigger, for justice, for Sam's honor, it lit a fire inside her. She could feel it flickering in her chest, a small, yet undeniable spark of hope. Jason continued, sensing the shift in her resolve. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I've seen what happens when people take a stand. Sometimes, it's not just about fighting the people who want to tear you down. It's about finding the people who want to help you rebuild. Rebuild, Lexi echoed the word softly, feeling the weight of it in her heart. Could she really rebuild? Could she really stand up against the tide of hate and cruelty that had been so persistent in her life? And if she did, what would that look like? Jason smiled, as if he had been waiting for this moment. You don't have to answer that now. I'm just here to show you that there's more to this story. More people who care. More opportunities than you think. Lexi let out a long, slow breath. For the first time in years, she felt a shift inside herself, a small but growing sense of possibility. It was like the chains that had bound her to this life of fear and isolation were starting to loosen. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Jason and Sam by her side. They were family, in their own way. "I don't know where this will lead," she said, her voice more steady now, the uncertainty starting to give way to something stronger. "But I'm willing to try. For Sam. And for myself." Jason stood up, his expression one of quiet pride. "That's all I need to hear. We'll do this together, Lexi. No more hiding. No more fear. We're going to take back what's ours." And in that moment, Lexi knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, she wasn't facing them alone. She had a team now. She had a purpose. And for the first time in a long time, she could finally begin to imagine a life beyond survival. Sam, from his spot on the couch, let out a soft sigh, as if he too understood the change. His tired eyes met Lexi's, and in that quiet exchange, they both knew that their fight had only just begun. But they were ready. They were ready to face whatever came next, together. A new ally. The next few days passed in a blur of activity, each one more frenetic than the last. Lexi had never been one to trust easily, but the presence of Jason felt different. There was an unspoken understanding between them. While Jason had his own mission, his own sense of justice, it was clear that helping Lexi and Sam wasn't just about righting some wrong, it was personal. He knew Sam's history, knew the value of the dog's loyalty and courage. Lexi wasn't just some random stranger to him. She was the keeper of something precious, and Jason was determined to help her protect it. By the time the weekend arrived, Jason had already made contact with several people he trusted, lawyers, former colleagues, even a couple of journalists who had been interested in stories of corruption in the local housing market. There were cracks in the system, he told Lexi, and if they applied the right pressure, they might be able to crack it wide open. But that meant taking risks, exposing things that had been buried for far too long. It meant putting everything on the line. The thought made Lexi nervous. She had always kept to herself, always kept her head down and tried to survive. The idea of confrontation, of taking on the system, made her stomach churn. But she wasn't just thinking about herself anymore. She had Sam to protect, and now, she had something even more precious. Hope. And with it came the courage to fight. That Saturday, Lexi sat at her kitchen table, a mug of lukewarm coffee in her hands, while Jason laid out his plan. He spoke quietly, as if the words themselves might carry some kind of danger. But Lexi listened intently, her mind already processing everything he said. There was so much to do, so many things to prepare. But this time, she wasn't doing it alone. "I've already got the ball rolling on a few things," Jason said, tapping a file folder on the table. "I've contacted a lawyer, he's looking into the landlord's history. There are rumors that he's been involved in some shady business with other properties, things that go beyond just mismanaging tenants. We're not the only ones he's done this to. He's been using his power to exploit people for years. We just need to find the right evidence to back it up." Lexi nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. She had suspected for a long time that the landlord wasn't just your average businessman. The way he'd treated her and the other tenants, it always seemed deliberate, calculated, as if he was trying to force them into submission. But the idea that he was involved in something larger, something more corrupt, made Lexi feel a mix of fear and exhilaration. "And the neighbors?" Lexi asked, her voice a little uncertain. "What about all the people who've been tormenting me, calling me names, throwing things at my house? What if they retaliate?" Jason's face darkened slightly. "We'll deal with them, too. I've already got people looking into the harassment. Some of those folks are involved in other criminal activities. I'm sure we can get something on them. The truth is, this neighborhood isn't as clean as people think. There are more eyes on it than you realize, Lexi." Lexi let out a breath, half relieved, half unsure. It felt strange to even be talking about this, about standing up to the people who had made her life hell for so long. But at the same time, it was empowering. For the first time in years, she was feeling like she had the upper hand. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting back. As Jason continued to explain the steps he was taking, Lexi found herself becoming more and more involved in the process. They needed her help. Her knowledge of the neighborhood, her history with the landlord, even the connections she had with a few of the other tenants, it all mattered. She wasn't some passive participant in this anymore. She was part of the plan. The next few days were filled with long conversations, frantic phone calls, and gathering evidence. Sam, sensing the change in the air, stayed close to her, as if he understood that something big was happening. His once slow movements had gained a little more energy, a little more purpose, as if he too knew that the fight was on. Lexi found herself reaching out to old friends, even acquaintances she hadn't spoken to in years. She needed people who could back her up, who could offer testimony, who might be willing to speak out against the landlord and the cruelty of the neighbors. And though she had never been particularly social, there were some who remembered her, not just as the woman who had lived quietly in the house on the corner, but as someone who had been through her own battles. People were starting to take notice of her again. It was a strange feeling, but also a powerful one. She was no longer invisible. But there was still so much to do. Jason had been right, there were cracks in the system. But the harder truth was that sometimes those cracks were so deep, they seemed impossible to fix. As Lexi and Jason continued to dig into the landlord's background, they uncovered more disturbing details. There were whispers of extortion, of shady deals, of threats made to tenants who dared to speak out. The landlord's influence reached farther than they had initially thought, and Lexi began to feel the weight of the fight they were about to undertake. One evening, after another exhausting day of research, Lexi sat on the worn couch, Sam curled up beside her. Jason had left for the day, promising to meet her again the next morning to go over the new developments. But as the door clicked shut behind him, Lexi's anxiety surged. This wasn't just about standing up to the landlord anymore. It was bigger than that. She was up against a system that didn't care about people like her, a system that had let her slip through the cracks and left her to fend for herself. And now, she was trying to tear it all down. It was a terrifying thought, one that kept her awake long after the sun had gone down. Sam, sensing her distress, nudged her gently with his nose, his eyes soft and reassuring. In that moment, Lexi felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude. Sam had always been there for her, through every hardship, every lonely night. And now, it was her turn to return the favor. She stroked his fur, her fingers trembling slightly. "We've got this, Sam. I promise. We've made it this far, haven't we?" Sam wagged his tail weakly, his old body still filled with a quiet sense of loyalty. He was with her. He had always been with her. And that thought, that bond, was enough to keep her going, even in the face of the overwhelming challenges that lay ahead. But Lexi wasn't the only one who had come to understand the weight of their situation. As the days wore on, the threats from the neighbors began to escalate. The eggs, the garbage, the taunts, they weren't just annoyances anymore. They were signs that things were about to get uglier. Jason had warned her that retaliation was inevitable, but Lexi wasn't ready to back down. Not now. Not when everything she had been fighting for, her home, her dignity, her future, was within reach. And so, they prepared. Jason brought in reinforcements. Private investigators, legal experts, and even a few former police officers who had crossed paths with Sam during his service. They were all ready to stand behind Lexi, ready to take on the fight that had been building for years. In the final moments before their plan would unfold, Lexi stood at the window, staring out at the street that had been both her prison and her battleground. The anger from the neighbors still filled the air, their voices rising in harsh, mocking tones. But Lexi was no longer afraid. With Sam by her side, and Jason and his team working behind the scenes, Lexi was ready to take back control. The fight had only just begun, but she was no longer fighting alone. This time, she had allies. This time, she had a reason to hope. The truth revealed. The air felt thick with anticipation, and Lexi could feel her heart racing as the days began to blend into one another. It had been weeks since Jason had walked through her door, offering his support and promising that together they would take on the forces that had been slowly eroding her life. Each day, they chipped away at the foundation of the corrupt system she had found herself trapped in. There were moments when Lexi felt a surge of hope, moments when she believed that maybe, just maybe, things could finally change. But those moments were fleeting. The truth was, she wasn't sure what would happen next. She didn't know if they had the strength to pull this off, or if the system was too deeply rooted to be exposed. But one thing was clear, she wasn't going to give up. Not now, not when so much was at stake. Not when Sam was depending on her. Over the last week, Jason's team had been working tirelessly. The lawyer he had found, a sharp woman named Maria, had begun digging into the landlord's past, uncovering records of tenant complaints, legal violations, and even more disturbing allegations. Lexi learned that the landlord, who had once seemed like a faceless figure who could do whatever he wanted, had his own dark secrets. He had been running a number of properties across the city, all of them in various stages of disrepair, and all of them with tenants who had been subjected to the same kind of harassment Lexi had endured. They weren't just random acts of cruelty, they were part of a pattern, a systemic abuse of power that had been allowed to fester for years. The more Maria uncovered, the more the picture became clear. The landlord wasn't just a bad property manager, he was a predator, preying on the vulnerable. And he had connections, powerful ones, that kept him insulated from the consequences of his actions. But that didn't stop them from digging deeper. Jason's investigators had tracked down multiple other tenants who had been mistreated, people who had been forced out of their homes or silenced through intimidation and threats. It wasn't just Lexi who had suffered, it was a whole community of people who had been pushed to the edge. Lexi's involvement in this was more crucial than ever. Jason had told her from the beginning that her story was the key. She had been one of the longest residents in the building, and her knowledge of the landlord's behavior, the incidents, and the pattern of harassment was invaluable. But there was more. They needed evidence. They needed proof to make sure that when the truth came out, it wouldn't be dismissed as another unfounded complaint. Lexi had never thought of herself as someone who could gather evidence, let alone bring down a powerful figure. But she had spent years being watched, being scrutinized, and she knew how to observe, how to remember things that others overlooked. She began taking notes on the conversations she overheard, the threats that were made in passing, the strange people who showed up at the property. At first, it felt almost absurd. How could something as simple as a casual conversation in the hallways of the building make a difference in a case this big? But the more she listened, the more she realized that she was hearing things that most people had long since tuned out. One day, while sitting at her kitchen table, Lexi found herself staring at the pile of notes she had collected. Each one felt like a small piece of a much larger puzzle. There were the names of tenants who had been harassed, the time-stamps of strange visits from unfamiliar faces, and even references to a large, unmarked van that had been parked near the property several times. She knew these were the kinds of things that Maria and the other investigators needed to connect the dots. This wasn't just about a broken system of tenant rights anymore, it was about something much bigger. It was about exposing a network of people who were exploiting vulnerable individuals, people who were profiting off of others' suffering. The evening before their meeting with Maria, Lexi found herself sitting with Sam on the couch, his aging body curled up beside her. The weight of everything was starting to press in on her. The fight was becoming real, and the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things felt. She had already experienced the hostility from the neighbors, the threats that had come her way. What would happen when the landlord found out she was working with Jason and his team? What would happen when the media got involved? Her mind raced with possibilities, but she couldn't allow herself to become paralyzed by fear. Jason had been clear, this wasn't just a fight for her and Sam anymore. This was for everyone who had ever been pushed down by people like the landlord. This was a fight for justice, a fight to make sure that the system couldn't continue to prey on the vulnerable. And Lexi wasn't about to back down now. The next morning, she met Jason at a small, nondescript cafe on the edge of town. It was their safe space, a place where no one would recognize them, where they could talk freely without fear of being overheard. Maria had sent word that she would meet them there, and Jason was eager to share the progress they had made. When Lexi arrived, she found Jason sitting in the corner booth, his laptop open and several files spread out in front of him. He looked up as she walked in, offering a warm smile. "Morning," he greeted her, his tone light, but Lexi could see the seriousness in his eyes. "We've got some good news. Maria's here, and she's got a lead on something big." Lexi sat down across from him, her nerves still on edge. "What's going on?" Jason leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room briefly before he spoke in a low voice. "We've got something. Maria's been digging into the landlord's financials, and she's found some discrepancies, large sums of money moving around, especially between properties. It's not just mismanagement, it's money laundering. The landlord's been hiding illegal activities under the guise of his real estate holdings. He's been working with a number of unsavory characters to cover it up." Lexi's stomach churned at the thought. The landlord wasn't just a crook, he was part of a much larger operation, a web of corruption that stretched far beyond the apartment building she lived in. He had been using his properties as fronts for criminal activities, hiding the evidence behind layers of paperwork and false accounts. "But there's more," Jason continued. "Maria's team tracked down a witness, someone who's willing to testify about a meeting they witnessed between the landlord and a few known criminals. These people aren't just loan sharks or petty criminals. We're talking about real players in the underground world. And they've been using tenants like you as pawns in a much larger game." Lexi took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "So, what now? How do we bring all of this to light?" Jason smiled, a rare look of optimism crossing his face. "Now, we go public. We take everything we've got, Maria's findings, the witness testimony, and everything you've gathered, and we push it into the open. We get the media involved, and we expose the truth. We take down the landlord and everyone connected to him." Lexi felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. But the reality of what she was about to do was beginning to settle in. There was no turning back now. Once the truth was out, there would be no hiding from the consequences. As they discussed the next steps, Lexi could feel a wave of determination rising within her. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had Sam by her side. She had Jason and his team. And she had the truth on her side. This battle wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who had ever been taken advantage of by people like the landlord. The time had come to tear down the walls that had kept the truth hidden for so long. They were going to expose the corruption, the abuse, and the injustice that had been allowed to fester for years. And when it was over, Lexi would finally have the chance to rebuild her life, and help others rebuild theirs, too. As they left the cafe, Jason put a hand on her shoulder, his voice firm but reassuring. "You're not alone in this, Lexi. We're in this together. And together, we'll make sure the truth is heard." With that, Lexi knew that the fight was no longer just a struggle for survival. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, and for the future. And it was a fight she was ready to win. The fight for justice. The following days passed with a new sense of urgency, the weight of everything they were about to do hanging over Lexi's every move. She wasn't naive, she understood the stakes now. They were no longer fighting just to get her eviction lifted or to put a stop to the harassment. What they were about to do would expose an entire network of corruption that stretched far beyond the landlord and his properties. If they succeeded, it would change everything for the people in the neighborhood, for the tenants who had been exploited and silenced for so long. But if they failed, the consequences could be devastating. Lexi knew she couldn't afford to fail, not with Sam depending on her. Jason had spent the last few days preparing the groundwork. They had filed the initial reports with Maria's lawyer, and the evidence had been handed over to several local journalists who had agreed to help with the investigation. Lexi, though reluctant to step into the spotlight, had been told that her testimony was the linchpin of everything. They needed her to be visible, to show the world that she wasn't just another faceless victim, but a woman who had endured years of injustice. Her courage, her voice, was what would resonate the most with the public. The media was abuzz, and though Lexi hadn't fully processed it yet, she knew there would be no turning back once they went public. The landlord would be forced to face the truth, and so would all of the people who had been complicit in keeping the system running. But as the days ticked down, Lexi's anxiety began to build. They had made great strides, but there were still risks. The landlord was no fool. He had his own team of legal experts, and there was no telling what lengths he might go to in order to protect himself. More than once, Jason had warned her about the retaliation they might face. The landlord's connections were deep, his influence wide. No one in the neighborhood was untouched, and some might still be willing to do his bidding, even if it meant resorting to threats, bribery, or worse. One evening, as the tension in the air grew thicker, Lexi stood in front of the small mirror above her kitchen sink, her reflection staring back at her with a mix of resolve and uncertainty. She had spent years keeping a low profile, doing her best to avoid the spotlight. Now, she was about to be thrust into the very center of it. She wasn't sure how she felt about that, but one thing was clear, she couldn't back down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. She glanced over at Sam, who was lying quietly by the door, his body still but his eyes alert. His age had begun to show more in the last few weeks, his gait slower, his breathing a little more labored. But he was still here, still her protector, and for that, she was grateful. No matter how much her body ached with fatigue, no matter how deep her doubts ran, she knew Sam's loyalty would never fade. And as long as he was beside her, she wasn't alone. The sound of a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Jason standing in the doorway, a determined look on his face. He had come to check in before the final push. Tomorrow would be the day they went public, and everything they had worked for would be revealed. He had a few last-minute details to go over with her. "Hey, Lexi," Jason said, his tone warm but serious. "You good?" Lexi nodded, though she could see the tension in her own shoulders. "I'm hanging in there. She paused, looking down at Sam. "I'm not sure what's going to happen after tomorrow." Jason stepped into the room, his gaze following hers to Sam. "I get it. I really do. But this is it. Tomorrow, the truth comes out, and once it does, it's not just your fight anymore. It's everyone's. You're helping a lot of people by doing this, Lexi. People who don't have a voice. People who've been silenced for too long." She looked back at Jason, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I've never done anything like this before. I don't know what it's going to feel like when the truth hits. When it's out there for everyone to see." Jason's smile was small but reassuring. "That's okay. No one's asking you to do this alone. We've got the evidence, we've got the witnesses, and we've got the media on our side. The only thing we need now is for you to stand firm. The rest will follow." Lexi nodded, taking a deep breath. Her heart was still racing, but she could feel a sense of purpose beginning to settle in. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, about exposing a system that had abused its power for far too long. And if that meant putting herself out there, if it meant confronting the people who had made her life a living hell, then so be it. The next day, the world seemed to move at a speed Lexi had never experienced before. Jason's team had arranged for her to meet with the journalists, and the moment she stepped into the conference room, everything felt surreal. The reporters, with their cameras and notepads, were focused on her, their eyes sharp, but there was no judgment in their gaze, only the kind of intensity that comes from knowing they were about to expose something important. The press conference was set. Maria was there, along with the lawyer who had worked tirelessly to uncover the landlord's financial misdeeds, and a handful of the other tenants who had agreed to come forward. It wasn't just Lexi's story anymore, it was a collective story, one that spoke of the pain and injustice endured by everyone who had ever been exploited by the landlord. Lexi felt her throat tighten as she approached the podium, but Jason's reassuring nod from the back of the room calmed her nerves. He had told her to stay focused, to remember that the truth was on their side. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had been pushed to the margins of the city, forgotten and ignored. "Good afternoon, everyone," Lexi's voice echoed through the room, steady but tinged with emotion. "My name is Lexi, and I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years. I've endured years of harassment and mistreatment, but it wasn't until recently that I realized it wasn't just happening to me, it was happening to everyone. We've all been manipulated, threatened, and abused by a system that was supposed to protect us." Her words hung in the air as she continued, telling her story, the harassment, the threats, the dirty tricks that the landlord had used to force tenants out of their homes. As she spoke, she could feel the weight of the years lifting off her shoulders. This was the moment she had been waiting for. This was her opportunity to be heard, to make sure that no one else would have to endure what she had gone through. And as she finished her statement, she could see the journalists nodding, taking notes, their attention unwavering. The cameras flashed, capturing every word, every emotion that ran through her. She knew this was just the beginning. By the time the press conference ended, Lexi was physically drained, but mentally, she felt a sense of liberation she hadn't known in years. The fight wasn't over, far from it. There were still the legal battles, the possible retaliation, the unknowns of what would happen once the media spotlight turned on the landlord. But for the first time, Lexi wasn't afraid. The truth was out there, and it couldn't be silenced anymore. As the journalists filed out, Jason approached her, his expression one of quiet pride. "You did it. We did it." Lexi smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "It's not over yet." "No," Jason agreed. "But we've made sure it's going to be heard. And that's the first step." As they left the building together, Lexi felt the weight of the last few months start to lift. There was still so much to be done, but now, she was no longer fighting alone. She had allies, real ones. And more importantly, she had hope. Sam, ever loyal, stood waiting by the door of her house when they returned. He had been there through every difficult moment, and he would be there as they faced whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, Lexi believed that justice wasn't just a distant hope, it was something they could reach. And she was going to fight for it, no matter what.